Good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening for the 2022 Kansas House of Representatives Forum, hosted by the Garden City Area Chamber of Commerce and the Chamber's Government Affairs Committee. We would like to first thank Finney County for the use of the facility for this event. We would also like to thank the following sponsors: the Chamber's Chairman's Circle members, Commerce Bank, City of Garden City, Dairy Farmers of America, and Golden Plains Credit Union. We would also like to thank the 2022 legislative sponsors: St. Catherine Hospital, Compass Behavioral Health, Garden City Community College. You're not getting special treatment here. Fry Eye Associates, Finney County Farm Bureau Association. My name is Laura Blake Bors, and I currently serve as the chairperson for the Chamber Government Affairs Committee and will serve as the moderator for tonight's event. Joining me to help keep track of time is Micah Bunch, president of the Chamber of Commerce. Tonight, we welcome the following candidates: vying for Kansas House of Representatives District 122, Representative Dr. Bill Clifford, and Mrs. Corinne Ray. Did I say it right? Okay. Vying for Kansas House of Representatives District 123, Representative John Wheeler and Mr. Bob Lewis. Candidates, thank you for taking the time out this evening and out of your busy schedules. We appreciate it. The process for tonight's forum will begin with each candidate providing a 1-minute opening statement, followed by the question and answer session, and will conclude with a 1-minute closing statement. I understand we have 2 attorneys here. I apologize, it's just 1 minute. The order of candidate introductions was drawn at random, and that order will be reversed for closing statements. Each candidate will be allowed 90 seconds to respond to each question. The order of candidates' responses will rotate for each new question. This is a closed question forum. No rebuttal questions or answers will be permitted. Without further delay, let's begin tonight's program. With our opening statements, with 1 minute each, we will start with Bob Lewis.
My name is Bob Lewis. Is that good? Good evening. My name is Bob Lewis. I'm a native Garden Cityan. I went to K through 12 here. I live on Center Street, just a block from where I grew up. My great-grandparents homesteaded here. My parents, Ed and Nelda Lewis, raised me and my siblings here. My mom still lives here. As John Wayne said, my roots are buried here. I have an office on Main Street where I work hard to advocate for crime victims. In the early 90s, I was a federal prosecutor. I've been endorsed by the Kansas Rifle Association and Trump's chief DEA administrator. Tonight, you're going to hear about 2 very important legislative initiatives: the Parent Bill of Rights and the constitutional law that would deregulate or rein in the regulatory state. My opponent, Representative Wheeler, opposes those. I support them.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis.
You will find that our answers
Lewis,
to that
thank
are
you.
very revealing about
Mr.
how we
Lewis.
will represent us in Topeka.
Mr. Lewis, I will remind you that we are on a strict time limit, and when you hear the second beep, you do need to conclude. Thank you. Mrs. Ray.
My name is Corinne Ray, and I grew up all over western Kansas. My parents owned a pizza business in northwest Kansas, and then they moved and took over my grandparents' farm in the middle of nowhere, 30 miles from basically Syracuse, Tribune, Leota, and Lakin. And I graduated from Syracuse Christian Academy after attending Lakin High School for a couple of years. I'm the 5th generation, basically farm kid in Kansas. My grandparents homesteaded out in their farm currently. My parents still live on the farm. And I just think that normal people need to try for this kind of stuff.
Thank you. Representative Wheeler.
Thank you. I'm Representative John Wheeler. I was born and raised in Garden City.
I'm sorry, John, I don't know if your microphone's on.
Thank you very much. My name is Representative John Wheeler. I was born and raised in Garden City, graduated Garden City High School in 1965, Fort Hays State College in 1969, at which time I enlisted in the United States Air Force, served from 1969 to 1973, honorably discharged with an Air Force Commendation Medal. I then completed the curriculum at Washburn University Law School in 2.5 years. Is that 30 seconds? Mm-hmm. Okay. I graduated cum laude in December of '75. I returned to Garden City and practiced in 3 local law firms, and one including mine myself, and until 1992. And then I was elected as Finney County Attorney, and I served that for 20 years during the growth of Garden City. I have served as your state representative for 6 years. I serve on the Judiciary Committee, Corrections and Juvenile Justice, and Local Government.
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. Representative Dr. Bill Clifford.
Good evening, Bill Clifford. I'd like to thank the sponsors tonight. 27 years ago, my wife and I were leaving Saudi Arabia. She was doing military service, and I was doing eye surgery. And we were looking for a community that would embrace us, a community where we could raise our children and continue our life of service. I found that here in Western Kansas, in Finney County and Garden City. I began my service as community college trustee and then spent 7 years here in this chamber as a Finney County commissioner. When Russ Jennings was tragically lost to cancer last fall, a precinct committee appointed me to fill out his term. I served the people of Southwest Kansas well in the House. I took 230 votes. I did not miss a vote or a day in the House. I'm here seeking a full term on my own merits, and I'd appreciate your support.
Thank you. The first question for this evening. What do you see as the 3 most important issues facing Southwest Kansas in the 2023 legislative session? And with this, we will start with you, Bill.
Thank you. Water. We just have to have it. It's the lifeblood of Southwest Kansas. I was at a water forum today in Wichita, and I attended the Farm Bureau listening tour here in Dodge City last week. We're depleting the aquifer. There's no doubt about it. We're mining water here in Southwest Kansas. We've got to find solutions. And I think if we don't find voluntary solutions, we're going to be having things imposed on us from the outside. Secondly, I think infrastructure is very important. Unfortunately, the Kelly administration has overlooked us. We in the legislature gave the Kelly administration $100 million to the Department of Commerce, and they put less than 0.5% into Western Kansas. So I would actually seek a change in administration, because I think Governor Schmidt would look fondly on Western Kansas and help us with infrastructure. Finally, I think we need to continue to embrace legal immigration. We need a lot of help from the feds to make that right. We need workforce. That's a big part of it. And anything we can do at the state level, I certainly would be in support of.
Thank you. Bob.
The 3 most important issues in my mind are schools, deregulation, and water. Our schools are in trouble. No one needs to tell you that our schools, our graduates are not performing as they should. Only 21% are college ready. Not only that, we've spent a lot more money in the last 15 years. Growth of funding has been 60%, much greater than inflation, but we haven't gotten any bang for the buck. We need to fundamentally rethink how we deal with our schools. We need to bring transparency, accountability, and choice. Florida's already done this. They've shown that it works. We should follow their lead. With respect to deregulation, our society is overregulated. There are 133 agencies in Kansas that either issue regulations or enforce them. Way too many. There are conflicts among them. They don't make sense. They're outdated. And there was a legislative proposal that my opponent opposed that would deal with that problem and bring it into some, allow the legislators to rein in the regulatory state. I think it's very important that we do that. And finally, water. I agree with Dr. Clifford that if we don't do it voluntarily, we're going to have it imposed on us. I don't want this area to end up a dry land and it to be depopulated, which will happen if we continue on our current course.
Thank you. Corrine.
The 3 most important ones for me, I think, are expanding current businesses and aiding those that were shut down because of government regulations 2 years ago. I also think that oil and gas in this part of the state is important. It's sad to see oil and gas pumps sitting idle when fuel prices are sky high and higher than we've ever seen. when we have 5 oil refineries in Kansas that could be producing those if we went back to local co-op type of productions and used our own gas and creating energy independence within our own state. And the more we make our own state free, then the more we have people come in and expand their businesses. And of course, I agree with the rest of them that water is extremely important in this part of the state. You know, it helps grow trees, and, you know, we didn't return to this part of the state years ago because I said, can we find some place with trees? And Dr. Wheat over in Lakin was like, she's not asking for much, is she?
Thank you. John?
Well, I think that property taxes are a serious issue. Fortunately, we did reduce at least a state portion of property taxes this last session, for which I voted. I agree with my opponent that education is a serious issue, but I have a different take on that. There is a concerted effort, in my opinion, to run roughshod over school districts, controlling their curriculum and everything else from the third floor of the State House, as if we pretend that we know better than our educators. I have voted against some of the school bills for that very reason. We have a constitutionally created state school board created in 1966 by constitutional amendment that is in charge of these issues. We need to leave it to them and not to us. I think local control is important, and any time that the state and the third floor want to take over running local government, I oppose that. I agree that agriculture is a serious issue out here. Water, is that my time?
Nope, one more.
Water, and I also agree with rural development issues, rural development of downtown agricultural towns that we are doing. Anything that is rural, I support. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question. What measures are you in favor of to help immigrants obtain the appropriate documentation to help them live and work in our community? And Bob, we'll start with you this time.
Well, we have a big problem in this state, in this community with immigration. First, we have much too much illegal immigration and not enough legal immigration. I think we should be very vigilant about protecting ourselves from the porous border that the Biden administration is not dealing with. And that means largely a law enforcement, it's mainly a law enforcement issue. As to providing support for people who want to immigrate into our community legally, who have the skills that are necessary for our agri-based businesses, such as, for instance, the Ukrainians who, it's the breadbasket of Europe. I think many of them should be welcomed into this community and could provide necessary labor for our breadbasket in Kansas. And so I would be in favor of supporting the refugee immigration from those kinds of communities.
Thank you. Corrine?
That's something that hit me hard when we were canvassing this area and for election stuff, because these people want to be U.S. citizens. And they will do whatever they can to become U.S. citizens. And if they think they can vote and they're allowed to vote, then they think that's what's happening. So I think measures to incentivize local groups, nonprofits, schools, things, to go into these communities, set up a potluck in their middle of their parking lot and encourage people to come in and bring in teachers to teach them how to speak the English language and educate them and find out what it is they need to feel like they want to be... I know they like to teach their own students and have their own schools, so how do we incorporate them into our own communities by reaching out to them, you know, reaching across the aisle to our neighbors and helping them learn English, helping them learn how to fit into our society and still welcome their cultures as well, because they can't get their citizenship without being able to speak English, but they're very resourceful.
John?
I still remember when I was in the first term of county attorney, I went into a local business and ran into a friend of mine who was a farmer rancher here in Finney County, and he looked at me and he said, "Wheeler, you're doing a great job, but leave my illegals alone." That's the reality in western Kansas. However, the dynamic has changed now that we have this open, porous border. These are not people that are seeking a new place to live. We have human trafficking, we have Narcotic trafficking is very dangerous. We don't know who we are incorporating into this society. It's a federal issue. It must be addressed on a federal level. Anything that we can do on the state level, I fully support. We have social service agencies like Catholic Social Services that provide all of the things that Mrs. Ray mentioned, education and those types of things. Immigration is a vital part of Western Kansas. They are a vital part of working in our beef plants, our feed yards, and everything, but we must keep control of it on a federal level.
Thank you. Bill?
Well, I agree with Representative Wheeler that this certainly is a federal issue and often out of our hands at a state level. But unfortunately, because of the porous southern border, we've all become border states. So I think our administration needs to be urged, our state administration needs to be urged to do everything possible to secure at least the Kansas state border and not allow this proliferation of illegal immigration. One of the things I've done in trips to Washington, D.C. is lobby for movement of immigration services to Western Kansas. Unfortunately, our legal immigrants have to renew passports, they have to renew their visas, they have to be fingerprinted, and the federal offices sit in Wichita, so folks are forced to take an entire day off. Family members may be driving them, and it's a very big inconvenience. One of the things we've been able to achieve is some mobile services to Dodge Liberal and Garden City, but I really think we need a more permanent presence of immigration services here. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe that Bill mentioned this a little bit in his opening statement, but what 3 transportation projects do you see as critical to Southwest Kansas, and how would you assist with completing those projects? And we'll start with Corrine.
Well, Amtrak having a more permanent location instead of just you jump on the train here in Garden City, similar to the one that's in Dodge, would be good. Busing would be excellent. Funding would be the only thing that you could do at a state level to start increasing the ability for people to move about in the rural areas without those that don't have vehicles. Other than that, I'm a little inexperienced in that kind of stuff. So, thank you.
Thank you. John?
Thank you. I think we need to stand on the head of KDOT. Money has been flowing into eastern Kansas for development of projects around the Kansas City and the urban areas. Out in this area, 156 suffered badly. We finally got just a mere inches of overlay. That is such a narrow highway, it needs to be expanded, it needs to have passing lanes and everything else. Now, I know that the agenda of the Chamber of Commerce is to create a 4-lane highway from the state of Kansas to I-70. I disagree with that. I think it should begin in the Mexican border of Texas all the way to Canada. It is the only transcontinental road in the United States, and it is perfect for an interstate. We need to stand on the head of KDOT. It's also going to have to take some federal involvement. That's 30 seconds. Let's see. I think that I'll quit.
Thank you. Bill?
I certainly agree with Representative Wheeler about K156. In fact, Ms. Ray lives on 156, so she well knows the conditions out there. I certainly support widening 4-laning of 5400 as an initiative from Western Kansas. I was at a bipartisan infrastructure bill discussion this morning with the Secretary of Transportation, Julie Lorenz. This state is due to get $3.8 billion with a B of infrastructure money. And we as a county, we as a district, we as a region need to be at the table to get some of that money. Fortunately, it's a 5-year plan, so the next administration will handle the bulk of it. Sometimes you have to play small ball when you're a legislator. You can't do the grand things. I've been able to help in Hodgeman County, which is one of my newly acquired counties through redistricting. They're trying to create a truck stop at 156 and 183, and they needed some ground from KDOT, and I was able to intervene with KDOT and get permits for them to go ahead with construction. And finally, just last Friday, we got the titling so that the bank would be satisfied and that project could continue. We've also been able to work with KDOT with the help of Senator Dahl to get realignment of the southern part of 83. We had some alignment issues, and we had to correct that and did.
Thank you, Bill. Bob?
Well, I agree that the work needs to continue and be expanded for Highway 56 and 83, but I want to look at this at a more global effort, a global level. You know, I've been hearing as I've gone and talked to people, Representatives Wheeler and others, that we do not get our fair share of monies here from KDOT. Well, one answer to that is the constitutional regulatory amendment that I mentioned earlier. That gives the legislatures a better opportunity to oversee how the executive branch of our state is working. And that's one reason I support it. And it's one way that we, the legislatures, can make sure that they're distributing this in fair share. The second thing I would say is I don't know why there isn't some sort of a formal or informal Western Kansas Legislative Caucus. Clearly, we have interests that don't accord with our Eastern brothers. And we should be getting together, especially since we've lost representation after the last census. We should be getting together and working together. And as far as I'm aware, that simply hasn't happened. We need much more coordination on behalf of our Western Kansas legislators.
Thank you. How can cities, counties, and the state work together to develop, implement, and streamline processes to relieve the housing shortage? John, we'll start with you.
Having coordination between those governmental agencies, did I understand your question?
Yeah, how can the three work together to develop, implement, and streamline processes to relieve the housing shortage?
What three?
Cities, counties, and state.
Well, sitting down and talking is a beginning, isn't it? It is always the beginning, but we can't force people to do that. That's up to your elected representatives locally to be willing to sit down and discuss it with each other. That's a very nebulous question because I think there's supposed to be some sort of goal achieved out of this, but any time that governmental agencies work together and cooperate, that's the best. I'm sorry if I seem to be avoiding this, but I remember back when I was county attorney, we were recognized by people who would come in here because our city and county worked closely together, coordinated together, and often met together. And I think that's the only way that we can accomplish that.
Thank you.
Pardon me if I misunderstood your question.
Bill?
This year, the legislature appropriated over $120 million towards housing. In the past, unfortunately, a lot of housing dollars have gone east. But this year, we crafted a bill which would guarantee it would go to rural communities, counties of under 8,000 people will get the largest subsidies, $37,500 per unit constructed. A county like ours, between 25 and 75,000, could get $30,000 per unit, and this can make creation of housing affordable. In addition, some of those dollars will go to make up appraisal, under appraisals. So often in communities where maybe 5 houses sold in the last year, a new house is built and the appraisals don't cover the cost of even construction. We've appropriated money to make up that difference so banks will be legal writing loans where the property appraisal doesn't come in at the construction cost. I think we need to continue to work with private developers. I certainly think the incentives will help us do that. And I'm excited to see these dollars flow here to Western Kansas.
Thank you. Bob?
Well, housing in this part of the state clearly is at a big shortage at all levels. It slows economic growth and people leave or don't come to here. It's really a desperate need we have. I was at the county commission debate or forum last night, and almost to a person, the county people running for county commission complained that we have regulations which are unduly delaying the building of housing in Garden City and increasing the price. So one thing we need to do is deregulate. Once again, the legislative constitutional amendment that would allow oversight and reining in of regulators by our state government would be the right step in the right direction. Also, that would allow them to review banking regulations. I don't know, but I suspect that there are state banking regulations that are not necessary for protecting the security of those banks with respect to mortgages and lending in that respect. I have a half minute? The other thing I would say is I agree with Dr. Clifford, and I know about the $120 million that was devoted this year and should have been to rural housing. We need to increase that numbers. And the other thing is, when we do that, we also need to realize that at least in the short term, some of the solution to our housing problem is to encourage the development and building of mobile homes. So I would hope in the next session that would be considered.
Thank you. Corinne?
Well, I'm probably going to give you a non-traditional answer to it. A lot of it is still a lot of what Bob said, and that is deregulation and encouraging tax incentives for maybe nonprofits to build homes, and because they're the most likely to be concerned about humanitarian issues. And of course, you've got to define what is a housing crisis. Is it that we have homeless people in numbers of streets all over? Because I know traveling across the state, there are a number of small communities that have lots and lots of houses for sale, but maybe they don't have jobs. So sometimes freedom is about being able to be your own boss, and so encouraging people, giving people the opportunity to start their own business sometimes increases economic expansion into the smaller communities, which also have homes available for them. That can be subsidized too by some of your nonprofit organizations, can help subsidize people to be able to buy their own home so that people have the opportunity to be able to house and have their own house. As far as some of the others, I think encouraging developers to create more apartment buildings for some of the community members.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What additional efforts are needed to support technical training initiatives that ensure our workforce is skilled in the trades necessary to support a growing economy and expansion of technical and career training in community colleges in Southwest Kansas? Bill, we'll start with you.
Well, as a former community college trustee, this topic was kind of near and dear to my heart. And really, we wouldn't have a nurse in Western Kansas, or hardly any nurses, if we didn't have Garden City Community College, Hayes, and others producing nurses. And that goes for mechanics, welders, carpenters, diesel mechanics. So we in the legislature have been very supportive of that. But as you know, being an educator yourself, the pathway to that begins in high school. And the legislature in the education funding has emphasized CT, or career technical education, and funded that very well. One additional thing this year is that we added computer literacy. Our children need to understand computers, whether they're working on a truck engine or they're in a law office. So there are dollars made available for training teachers in computer education so that they can go back to the schools and educate our children.
Thank you. Bob?
Well, obviously, community colleges in this part of the state are critical. We don't have four-year colleges. We rely heavily on community colleges, and I support them fully. People tend to stay where they're educated. That's another solution to our labor problem. Let's educate them here and help get them to stay here and work. In the last 12 years, funding for community colleges has not kept pace with inflation. It's basically then gone down, whereas funding for our university systems has gone up. I think that's not right. It doesn't support this part of the state, and we need to demand more funding for community colleges. Furthermore, there's a Promise program, and I think that was what Dr. Clifford was alluding to, which provides scholarship aid to first instant nurses or people who are engaged in the aerospace industry. I'm all in favor of that, but once again, Western Kansas was left out. It didn't provide scholarship aid for agribusiness, for welding, for agronomy, for water drilling, for truckers, and I just recently met with truckers. There's a desperate need for more truckers in this state. But there's a new regulation that just was imposed on them. They now have to be licensed. They have to go to 8 weeks of training. They have to pay $3,000. And I oppose that, but at least we should be able to provide them with the necessary scholarship aid so that we can take care of another problem, the trucking problem in this community.
Thank you. Corrine?
These are all great ideas. I think something that would add to it too would be to incorporate maybe an apprenticeship program that was maybe a collaboration between your community colleges and your businesses, so that they could actually basically your students would be work studies, and they could go to like a trucking agency or and they could study that way and get their, maybe kind of a, they'd be working and also getting their degree after they got their basic studies, and it would help the student as well as keep the funding, the expense down for both the student and the college, so we wouldn't have to actually increase the funding. And it would also help meet some of the demand for labor in the rural areas. We'd have to focus out, because Garden City's kind of the, community college is kind of the hub, and but it is, he's right, when people are educated in an area, they tend to stay there, especially if they were apprenticed and they like their job. So community college is going to be used as a chance to explore, the options that they like, and then apply to some apprenticeship programs and the jobs in the area, and maybe they'll stay.
John?
These are all good ideas. It's kind of bad to be left the last in this list, but I do think that we have focused a great deal of attention on our regent universities and pouring money into them and obtaining degrees that for many are simply unusable. And I do think that we need to focus dollars into our community colleges. I'm a big fan of community colleges. I think Garden City is an excellent example of working to create a workforce in our town. Empirical is a good example, who is building and will need 300 employees, but they need to be trained. And Garden City Community College is doing that in cooperation with Empirical. That can be done across the board with all sorts of trades. We've got welding now in Garden City. Goodland is an excellent example, but now Garden City is matching them. Apprentice programs, I think, are a great idea. And I do think that we need to focus more money into our community colleges, and I'm fully in favor of that.
Next question. What water conservation and reuse efforts do you believe could make a substantial impact throughout Southwest Kansas? And Bob, we'll start with you.
One initiative that I just learned about the other day is being discussed by our city government, and that is to somehow take the wastewater from our milk processing plant and make it drinkable, and I fully support those efforts. As far as answers to our water conservation problem, I can't say or presume to be able to give you that. I know that it's an important issue. I've talked with a number of people. Quite frankly, I haven't heard any silver bullets out there. It's going to come up. It's going to be a big legislative issue in the next session. There's discussion of reorganizing the way we manage our water resources throughout the state. I look forward to being part of that discussion and exploring solutions.
Corrine?
Yeah, we probably won't have clean water in 2030 if we don't do something as a society. So I'm clueless as to, all the major things we can do. Farmers can do irrigation tailwater pits, and irrigate back out of those so that, they have drainage systems that go into their tailwater pits. We did that in Northwest Kansas. I'm with Bob, it's just a matter of sitting down and talking about it. I think maybe the shortage of farm fertilizer that we're seeing coming from China will kind of help take us back to more natural solutions in the way we farm, so that we aren't polluting our what little water we do have in western Kansas. You know, that may not make the farmers very happy, but there are solutions in fertilizing your crops other than, you know, some of the harsher chemicals that are polluting our water. Does that help the rainfall? No, not really, but, you know, we've tried everything else out here, so, you know, grow some more trees and, you know, recycle, throw your wastewater, your brown water out on your flowers, and, you know, small things all add up, so.
John?
I think the concept of using water from the milk plant is interesting. However, I think it would be very expensive to make that potable. We are recycling our water from the milk plant. It is being distributed around Garden City and used to irrigate in places such as parks and recreation areas and such as that. It's being used effectively. Now, as to conservation, I don't pretend to be the farmer of the year. However, I've been out and watched demonstrations of good irrigation projects, the dragon lines where water is placed right on the ground where it's needed, not sprayed into the air where it is evaporating, metering your fields to see what your groundwater levels are so that you know when you need to water there but not here. That can all be controlled by your personal phone. So I think those are things that we really need to look at, and I know we are looking at them. I can say with regard to the groundwater right around Finney County, we were advised years ago that if we use conservative methods of irrigation, our groundwater will not decline, but it is declining. So we need to act fast.
Bill?
Well, this year the legislature had a water committee, and although I wasn't assigned to it, I was fortunate to have enough free time to attend a dozen of the meetings. Coming out of that was a 260-page bill. Agriculture lined up against that bill because it really centralized control of water in Topeka. For me, local solutions work best. We have the GMDs, and we need to work through the GMDs to make things happen. But again, voluntary solutions. And we domestic users need to be at the table. I know in other states you can't wash your car every day. You can't water your lawn every day. We don't even have those restrictions as citizens. We think that agriculture needs to figure it out. Obviously, they are the biggest user out here, but we're all at the table because we all depend on water. We had a very good discussion this morning in Wichita about water. I visited Spirit Air Systems yesterday. They need 1 million gallons of water a day to make 737 bodies. That water's coming out of the sewage system of Wichita, Kansas, and made to be potable water, but it's actually used for cleaning in the plant. I think we need to do more of that. I've visited USDA with the Garden City city manager years ago looking for money for recirculation of the water off DFA, and I'm really glad to hear that those dollars are coming to fruition, and we're actually doing that now.
Thank you. The 5-year plan arising out of the Gannon litigation to make school funding adequate and equitable will be completed in fiscal year 2023. The legislature agreed as part of that plan to adjust funding for inflation each school year beginning in fiscal year 2024. What is your position on school funding, and will you comply with the findings and orders issued by the court? Corinne, we'll start with you.
First of all, the Supreme Court is not the people's piggy bank for managing money, and like we've talked about, the more local control you have, the better off it is. Your school systems, you know, you live in a place because you like the people, you like their values, and therefore you should all be able to come to the table and say, this is what we want to teach, and this is how we want to manage our money, and it should stay here. It should not have to go back to the state. So if you have a school system and you like what you're doing and you want to save, and everybody agrees, all your teachers, all your administration says, we want to expand, or we want to, build new buildings, or we want to add new buses or whatever, you keep your funding. You don't send it back to Topeka, and you save for capital improvements, for increasing your, whatever you want to do in your local school district. You shouldn't have to send it back to the state to be reapportioned. So that's one of the major fallacies that I think has happened in our legislative process, and we've removed it from local control. So if the school district can manage their money, they should manage their money. It shouldn't go to the state level.
John?
The fact of the matter is Gannon does exist, and it is a ruling by the Kansas Supreme Court that it is constitutionally required. Shoulda, coulda, couldn't, whatever, doesn't apply. The only way that can be changed is by a constitutional amendment that says the Supreme Court does not have authority to oversee the education program. Otherwise, it exists, and we can't stick our head in the sand. I think it's important that we in the legislature do fully fund our schools. We have talked this year that we have fully funded our schools, and yet our special education is not fully funded where it needs to be. And in light of the fact that we now have legislation passed that allows students to go from one district to another, even if they may be special ed students that cost that school more money, they have no way to plan their budgets for this. But it is the law of this state now, so we have to accept that as well. We must fund our schools, particularly our high schools and our grade schools. So I would support that until such time as it changes constitutionally. By the way, that's the lawyer in me. When it's constitutionally required, the lawyer in me says, I swore to uphold the Constitution of the state of Kansas. Many don't.
Bill?
Well, there's no appetite in the legislature to take on the courts over this. I heard it in the hallways of this session. So we will continue to fund public education. But I think one thing the legislature will demand is accountability. The legislature wants to see results of that investment. They want to see graduation rates improve. They want to see certificates for kids going into technical programs. So I think you'll continue to see that. But one thing I will oppose in Topeka is that 66612 solution. That's the zip code of the capital. This year, we had an education budget that was going to force schools who had underachievement in math to use a specific $4 million commercial program to improve their math scores. That's not the kind of micromanagement we need to be doing in Topeka. I do think local officials know best. I agree with my opponent that we need to get the money to the local level and let them manage it where they know it's best spent.
Bob?
Gannon is the law of this state, but it shouldn't be. Adequacy is the constitutional demand, and it's clear empirically to anybody that wants to look at it that money is not the answer to our school problem. And so I fundamentally disagree, but yes, as a legislature, at least as long as Gannon is on the books and required, we will follow that. This does raise the fundamental difference between, I think, my opponent, Representative Wheeler's approach to just go along, same old, give more money, expect different results. No, we need to fundamentally change our approach to education with transparency, accountability, and choice. In 2003, Kansas did much better on all the metrics than Florida. It's just the opposite today. Florida doing better than we are, and the only difference is that they pursued transparency, accountability, and choice. They still today spend $3,000 less per capita than we do. We spend $17,000, and we don't get what we deserve.
Next question. What is your position on Medicaid expansion in Kansas? John?
First of all, my opponent's response was rebuttal. Secondly, addressing your question, I have always supported expansion of Medicaid in Kansas. We are letting millions and millions and billions of dollars left on the table that are sorely needed here in Kansas. The last I heard from the Hospital Association in their briefing is that we have 30 small hospitals in the state of Kansas that are on the verge of closing because there's not adequate funding within the Medicaid program to keep them to survive. Now, I have been asked to join a company to assist small hospitals with that, and I'm looking at doing that. But still, that doesn't address the answer of why are we not at least taking advantage of that which is available to this state to treat our people in our hospitals and in our doctor's offices when these millions of dollars are just being left on the table. Thank you very much.
Thank you. May I take a moment to, thank you. Bill?
Well, I've surveyed the district. I've been to every hospital in District 122, and I've also gone out to Hodgman County to see what their thoughts were. Every one of our hospitals wants Medicaid expansion, but there are political realities in Topeka, and I assure you that Medicaid expansion is dead on arrival given the current leadership makeup. But there are ways around that. I served on the Social Services Budget Committee. We expanded funding for Larned State Hospital and Osawatomie Hospital. We put up $15 million for Wichita to develop a new hospital, and they're looking for matching spark funds to create that facility, which is badly needed. OBGYNs in this country, and I'm fully pro-life, are doing the deliveries of Medicaid babies. They haven't been paid differently for over 30 years for delivering babies to Medicaid moms. We were able to increase that funding. We have a year of Medicaid health care for that young child so it can have a good life. Mothers were cut off at 3 months. We were able to extend that to 1 year to make a healthy mom to keep a healthy child. So I think Medicaid is flawed at the federal level. Our federal officials need to work on it, but we are doing the best we can to extend wages to nurses, to improve fees to hospitals. Thank you.
Bob?
The issue of Medicaid expansion is obviously very contentious. People in this room probably differ just half and half. I note that the State Chamber of Commerce opposes Medicaid expansion. Local chamber supports it. I have thought long and hard about this, and I'm still open to listening, but I'm quite skeptical. Medicaid is a very failed program. There's rampant fraud, 10 to 15%, and it doesn't, as Dr. Clifford pointed out, the Medicaid program we now have isn't serving the population it was designed to serve. Before we expand the program, we need to make sure that it's serving and doing the job that it should. So my first point is, let's make Medicaid work for the people it was designed to work for before we think about expanding. As far as the federal government supplement, I don't think that's going to continue. You look at the federal fiscal situation, debt sky high, interest rates rising, aging population, commitments overseas. We aren't going to be able to, the federal government's not going to be able to continue to support federal, the Medicaid expansion. And if we expand it, we're then going to become with an unfunded entitlement. Also, I'd point out that 2 sessions ago, Medicaid expansion passed in our House of Legislature. My opponent voted for it, and in that bill, he especially voted for funding being spent and given to Planned Parenthood. I will never
Thank
do
you,
that.
Mr. Lewis. Corinne?
Well, I'm not a fan for the same reasons that these two are not fans, and but I am a fan of President Trump's idea that hospitals need to publish their cost so that people can choose, because competition in a free society is always paramount. And I think that if we decrease taxes, the average American spends greater than 30% and has it taken out of their paycheck. And I think if they had more in their paycheck and they could see where how much things cost to begin with, I think that they could choose where they wanted to spend their money and not have to be dictated by a Medicaid, where they wanted to go for their care. I do think that, the OBGYNs need a pay raise, but I think we also need to deregulate a little bit more, maybe some nursing, and make it easier for nurse practitioners to do home births if patients so choose. But otherwise, I agree with both these gentlemen.
Thank you. In this past legislative session, several bills and constitutional amendments were considered whose topics may fall under the purview of a different branch of government. Please explain your philosophy of separation of powers and infringing on other branches of government. Bill?
Well, I certainly believe in the state constitution, but we legislators need to stay in our lane. You're right. There's a tendency to drift and try to take over executive function. But I do think that we legislators, on behalf of the citizens who elect us, deserve the right to oversee the administrative state, to look at regulations, get rid of unnecessary regulations. So you'll see that on the ballot in November. We approved one sheriff for one county, with the exception of Riley County, which does not use the sheriff model. I think putting that on the ballot for the people to decide is appropriate. It's not infringing on another portion of government. Obviously, you know that we'll have value them both on as an amendment to the Constitution in our August primary 3 weeks from now. And I think we Kansans will define ourselves as a people the way we vote on value them both. We candidates, we elected officials will come and go, but I think a yes on value them both will determine what kind of people we are in Kansas, and I'm fully supportive of it.
Bob?
Well, I'll address the constitutional amendment on deregulation. So everybody understands currently the legislature to oversee and rescind a regulation that's issued by the executive branch has to go through lawmaking, which means presenting the issue for signature by the executive branch, which of course has promulgated the rule and isn't going to rescind it. There's an interesting history here. Our regulatory state, the administrative state, has grown up as a progressive era, as a progressive idea that was originally that of Woodrow Wilson's. The idea was that we as people don't really know how to regulate ourselves. We need experts to do it. And you've seen that over the last 100 years develop and develop and develop. We actually had the legislative veto in Kansas and in the United States federal government until the 1980s, when the United States Supreme Court and the state Supreme Court declared them unconstitutional. That was fine. That probably comports with the Constitution, but it doesn't recognize the fundamental change in our system of government because of the buildup of the administrative state. Therefore, I believe we do need a constitutional amendment to ensure that our legislators have oversight and can rescind job-destroying and overburdensome regulations.
Corinne?
That's exactly what, in legal jargon, what I would say. And the people need to be in control. What we've witnessed, especially in Topeka, and I think we're seeing it at the federal level, is that there's a power grab between the three branches of government, and then it also trickles down to your city governments, your municipal, and the state legislatures, state governments need to stay out of the city. Like Bill said, we need to stay in our own lane. And what happens is the governor creates a different branch, like he said, that further tries to override the legislatures, the senators, and the people need to be in control and not create regulating agencies to try to control the people. And so therefore, like he said, we really need the legislature to be able to override the appointment of all the different executive regulatory bodies.
John?
Has anybody else noticed that what we're calling for by those who are out on the right wing is governance by constitutional amendment, by golly? Let's just pass a constitutional amendment and everything and concentrate all power on the third floor of the State House. It is absurd. The third floor of the State House can't make a decision in 90 days, let alone 30 minutes. So we begin by saying our government is constituted on the federal and state level, with the exception of a few states, of an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial. They are co-equal branches of government. What we have in trying to regulate an executive agency is to say, Governor, you don't have any power anymore. And I oppose that as a constitutional lawyer. That's just absurd to me. Now, we do have power when there is a terrible regulation to regulate it by statute. We don't need what these people are calling for. All we have to do is to do our job, govern accordingly with good policy and good governance, and that will take care of it.
Considering the recent U.S. Supreme Court decision related to abortion, if the constitutional amendment to the Kansas Constitution passes, and if you are elected in November, what statutory changes or limits would you support regarding abortion in Kansas? Bob.
Well, first of all, we need to understand that if value in the vote doesn't pass, we will be an abortion on demand state. We will be the equivalent of California and New York. We will be an abortion destination state. I pray every night that we do the right thing and we pass value in the vote. If we do pass value in the vote, first of all, I would support, in fact, there are about 18 or 19 reasonable restrictions that we now have on the books. Those will be wiped off if we don't pass value in the vote. But those include, for instance, parental consent for minor abortions, a waiting period, informed consent, hygiene inspection of abortion clinics. I support all of those, and I would encourage, and I would also consider more restrictive laws. But I would say this, that I do not support restrictions on abortions where carrying the baby to term is a serious threat to the mother's health or death, and in case of incest and rape.
Thank you. Corinne.
The way the language is written in Value Them Both kind of gives a carte blanche to the legislature to do whatever they want. And I think that government is already too involved in healthcare, and they need to stay out. I am profoundly pro-life, but I think that we need to manage that life the same as we would at the other end of the spectrum when they're dying. So if if a patient's really sick at the end of their life and they want to donate their body, then they have special consents for that. I think informed consent's great. I think notification of minors. But I think giving carte blanche permission to the legislature to make those kind of decisions is dangerous, considering my interactions with a lot of legislators this last 2 years has not been one where they listen. So we just need to be careful how we let government intervene between the doctor and patient relationship.
John.
I'm pro-life. I believe life begins at conception. I also recognize realities in the medical field. I will vote yes on that amendment, but I will tell you that if it passes, I am concerned when it gets to the House and the Senate with the arch right-wing leadership that immediately may bring to the floor a bill to ban abortion in the state of Kansas, as 16 other states have already done. Now, I don't agree with that. I think that there's health of mother. I think rape and incest. There are babies that are conceived that are being carried whose brain is outside of the skull. Of course, we need to look at medical abortions up. However, I don't like abortion being used as birth control, and I think that it is being used in that fashion now. If somebody is seeking an abortion, then I think that decision, with exception of medical emergencies for the mother, needs to be made before 16 weeks.
Bill.
The Kansas legislature has put reasonable guardrails up to guide and control abortion. However, unfortunately, since the 2018 state Supreme Court decision, the New York Center for Reproductive Rights has come to Kansas, and they've disregarded, or they've gotten 2 of those laws thrown out. One would be inspection, health inspection, as you heard before, of an abortion clinic. I'm an eye surgeon. My eye surgery is subject to no notice state inspection at any time. That's not for my benefit, that's for my patient's protection. The second thing that's been thrown out, thanks to the New York Center for Reproductive Rights, is late dismemberment abortion. I will absolutely vote for rules that prohibit that. I do, as a physician, recognize there are circumstances like tubal pregnancy which threaten the life of the mother, and we need to keep those exceptions. But we need to pass value them both to return the right to control abortion in the state of Kansas to the legislature, which is elected by the people, and not have this promulgated by 7 members of the Supreme Court.
By Kansas statute, special education is to be funded at a 92% level of excess costs. Currently, the state is funding 70%. In this past legislative session, considerable discussion was had regarding increasing the funding for special education. What is your position with regard to adequately and appropriately funding special education? John.
I have heard since the end of this session that this time we fully funded education, and no, we did not. Special ed, as I mentioned earlier, was not funded adequately, as you point out. I am in favor, above all else, of fully funding special education. It didn't happen. It's done. The session is over. But I think next session, we need to work harder to get leadership in the Education Committee to bring out a bill that fully funds all aspects of our education program and quit walking around and crowing, "We fully funded education." That's false.
Bill.
During this session, a representative from across the aisle came down to the well and proposed an amendment that would have added full funding for special education. And as you heard from Representative Wheeler, unfortunately, leadership put the kibosh on that. The logic was that although we had excess funds this year, in the out years, the following years, we could not afford to fund that. Once we raise the bar of state funding, the feds hold us to that number. We finished this last fiscal year, June 30th, with another huge surplus, $2 billion, and we put almost $1 billion in the rainy day fund. So again, we will go back to Topeka with a $3 billion surplus, some of which is going to be protected in the rainy day fund. But I do think the funding stream exists that we need to adequately fund special education in this session.
Bob.
I support full funding of special education.
Corinne.
I think we need to just streamline and define special education and what requires that. And I take that from being a mom of a special needs child that was pretty much in a persistent vegetative state, and they wanted to have him meet Common Core standards, and he was not capable of doing that. He could not have his own bowel movements, so let alone how could he meet Common Core standards. And they wanted to do these testings, and they brought me in and they said, how do we do these alternate tests? You know, we need to do these alternate testings for him. And I was like, why are we wasting money so that Trevor can spend time with other kids and be expected to meet standards that we all know he can't meet? And they're like, well, we're glad you asked that question because we can't tell you, but you can opt out. So parents need informed consent, again. Transparency is an important part of government, so that they can make those kind of decisions for their child and not have it mandated onto them.
Thank you. In a recent advertisement, the issue of Finney County crime was addressed. Please state what you believe your role in the Kansas legislature has with regard to local law enforcement and what you have specifically done to address the crime issue. Bill.
Well, I think we need to enforce the laws that exist, and we need to have the backup law enforcement by fully funding law enforcement. We also need to protect our first responders, and if that means additional equipment, additional bulletproof vests, videos to protect them legally, we need to fully fund that. This year, I did violate my rule that I will always support local control, and I violated it one time because the city county of Wyandotte had proposed a sanctuary bill. And I felt that it was inappropriate to tie the hands of law enforcement to keep local law enforcement from taking criminals who are illegally here and bringing them to ICE officials in the federal government. So as a legislator, I've supported that. I have not supported sanctuary cities, and I will stand firm on that so we can allow our law enforcement to get rid of criminals who are here illegally.
Bob?
It's absolutely true that crime's up in this part of the state. Violent crime up 12%, property crime up 58%. We all know about the drug problem that we have in Garden City. And I'd also point out that in recent years, the criminals have become much more sophisticated. That could be largely a result, once again, of the porous border, as the drug cartels are doing human trafficking and selling drugs and bringing them across the borders. What that means is we have to redouble our efforts at a local level, especially to give the resources and the training to our local officials, local law enforcement, so that they can do their job. Also, we need to encourage them to work more closely with the federal government. There's a DEA office in this area, and I talked to the sheriff last night. They're working closely, and I encourage that to continue. We also need to consider strengthening our sentencing laws in this state. They don't give prosecutors and judges sufficient ammunition to put repeat offenders, violent crime offenders, drug traffickers in prison for a very long term, and they're therefore back on the streets too soon. Finally, we need to deal with early intervention. That means when we recognize at an early age an at-risk kid, that we reach out to him or her and do everything we can to prevent them from pursuing a life of crime.
Corinne?
Obviously, since I don't live in Garden City, I haven't done anything about it. I'm not in an elected position, but you know, as a legislator, again, it comes back to staying in the lane. You guys elect, you know, the people of the area elect the sheriff. You have the most influence on him, and you also have the best ideas of what's going on in your community. And I think legislation needs to, you know, the state legislators need to stay out of the county.
John?
The reality is this. I serve on the judiciary and the corrections and juvenile justice. And the reality is, let's not get harder. Let's not lock them up longer. Let's do that. We have gone through a process by outside people doing a study of criminal justice reform. And the bills are being brought to our committees and to the floor of the House to say, okay, our prisons are overcrowded and we don't have the money to do it. We need to shorten sentences. And that's going on all the way across the board. And it has been for the last 2 years. So the reality is we're not getting tougher on crime. We're getting easier on crime. Now, thank God the DEA came back to Garden City. They did leave for a while. Now they're back, having recognized the gravity of the drug issue. And it's not just local street dealers. We're talking cartel people that are in our area. And believe me, they are fully armed. And we need to address this issue on an issue that might even approach Army type of responses to some of these things. I had to deal with a bill where they wanted to take away no-knock warrants, where the officer says, I'm a police officer, and they shoot him 13 times through the door. That was common.
Thank you. What is your perception of the regulations regarding childcare, and what changes do you believe are warranted? Bob?
Well, childcare is obviously an important issue here. Among other things, it's important for the deal with the labor shortage in our community. I think childcare and daycares is largely a local issue. It's also not one that government should be heavily involved in. The charities, the churches, they're doing a very good job. We should encourage them to continue and help them as we can. But ultimately, I don't think it's a government issue at the bottom. The other thing I would say is, once again, deregulation. There was a case in Garden City a few years ago where they were building a daycare center, and because of conflicting state mandates, they had to build and then rebuild the daycare center. It delayed the opening of that by almost, I think, over a year. It cost a lot more. So once again, regulations are getting in the way of helping our people, and we need to deal with that.
Corinne?
Again, deregulation so that we don't need as many taxes and, we don't have as much taxes taken out of your pay, then you can afford to maybe have one parent stay home when the government's not so big, and then you don't have as worried. But, again, it's a local matter and to determine the safety and the standards that you want as a community.
John?
I don't think it's a local matter because I agree with my opponent that there are some regulations with regard to daycare that inhibit the ability of us to develop. I don't know if my opponent is specifically talking about the Church of the Nazarene. Church of the Nazarene tried to open a daycare. They came in with inspection and said, oh, you've got the bathroom, you've got the sinks in the bathroom. You have to put them in the hallway. So they had to completely replumb. And then when they got it all done, the fire marshal came in and said, well, now you have to have new blueprints to put on file. That delayed more than a year. It was years that we got that child care open. It is known that in home daycare, you have to have certain licenses, and that includes the people who help you. So what really happens is there's not enough trained people around, so you steal from another child care. We need to address that issue as to how much do we really need to regulate these people who are providing the child care services. And that doesn't even come down to the number of kids that are missing from dependent and family. I mean, we have so many kids that are missing, and that's not exactly daycare, but they're lying on floors in offices and being raped.
Bill?
Well, the availability of affordable childcare is a workforce issue. It's an economic development issue. We talked about housing already. I think those two things are the biggest impediment to expanding our workforce. We have the wages, we have the job, but people have to have a safe place for their children. I had an interesting position in the Senate in the session, being on the Social Services Budget Committee. The woman in charge of daycare regulation came into us to talk to us about her budget. And she proudly said that for the last 6 years, they've not had an infant SIDS death in daycare. But I challenged her, because if we took all the cars off the road, we wouldn't have a car accident. And I challenged her to look at her regulations to see how they have impeded the development of daycare in Kansas. I know child death is acceptable, but we've overregulated to the point where we cannot encourage folks to create daycares, and they're not affordable. We in the legislature have a tool. It's called a legislative post-audit, and I will be asking for an audit specifically of childcare to see the effect of Kansas regulation and how it has impacted childcare in Kansas.
What are the regulatory barriers to transforming healthcare in Kansas, and how do you plan to address those issues? Corrine?
Regulatory barriers. There are many. Number one, I think some of it comes down to definition. Some of it comes down to the government saying, you can only have this because this is what your insurance pays for. Again, we need to get healthcare or get government out of healthcare and leave it between the doctor and the patient. CMS is a big problem. It regulates to the nth degree, and your insurance makes it very, very hard sometimes to get the care you need. And a lot of times they'll be like, well, we can't pay for that, or durable medical equipment, so we can't pay for that wheelchair because your insurance won't pay for the updates or whatever. So the more we have independent decision making, the better off we are.
John?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand your question.
What are the regulatory barriers to transforming healthcare in Kansas, and how do you plan to address those issues?
I'm not sure I can really answer that question. I'm being honest about that because it's something I don't serve on the Health and Human Services Committee, and I don't know all of the regulatory barriers. But should a bill or an issue arise, then I can educate myself on that. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I'm an expert in that field, because I am not.
Bill?
We've made some headway on improving access to care. This year in the legislature, we allowed pharmacists to do point-of-care testing on strep and flu and UTIs and treatments. Those protocols were all worked out with the Kansas Medical Society ahead of time, vetted in committees, and that legislation did pass to improve access. So I do think there are ways that we can improve access. Obviously, the nurse practitioners pushed through a bill. I wish it would have had some other patient protections in it, but again, that's a way to improve access. I do think there's a big problem with the cost of pharmacy, and that's a nationwide problem. And it's due because of organizations known as Pharmacy Benefit Managers, PBMs. The feds, because of the federal political situation, have not been able to deal with it, but the Supreme Court allowed us at the state level to deal with pharmacy benefit managers. This year in the legislature, we passed a rule to, rather than register pharmacy benefit managers working in Kansas, we required them to license. And now it allows us significant oversight. At one point, we couldn't even audit the cost of the state Medicaid drug program for certain PBMs. That's gone now, and we'll be looking to see how they're operating in Kansas.
Bob?
So I generally think that in this part of the state, we all know that we have a medical staffing shortage. And although we would love it if we could get enough doctors here, the fact of the matter is, at least in the short run right now, we can't do that. We're therefore going to have to look at other alternatives. One was the registered nurse practitioners bill that passed that allows them to operate their own practices without oversight or license or some sort of contract with the doctors. I think that was a very good bill. I supported that. And with all respect and due respect to my friend Dr. Clifford, I do think once again that we need to look hard at looking at non-doctor medical providers to help us to bring medical services to this part of the state. Finally, I would say that if you're talking about giving the legislature some power over the regulators and the regulations, you need to support the constitutional amendment, which will be on your ballot on November. Vote yes, so that the legislature has the power when they see something that's not working at the regulatory level to do something about it.
Thank you. You all have been on the hot seat for a little while now, so we're going to start with our last question. At several of our legislative coffees this past year, the issue of House and Senate leadership arose. Do you believe that it is more important to seek a leadership role in the House and make decisions based upon the leadership position, or vote your conscience and ensure that your votes benefit your constituents? John?
I can simply answer yes to that, but I'd like to expand. I am not ashamed to say that I'm a moderate in the House of Representatives, and I'm proud of that. And I am interested in governance. I am interested in policy. I'm interested in working across the aisle for the benefit of my constituents. What I have seen over the last 4 years is a movement to the right in leadership where a lot of the things that are taking place are ideological rather than practical. I always look to what do my constituents need. I look to whether or not the bill addresses that issue and does it address it correctly. And I've heard of, I'm going to vote against this, but if it looks like it's going to pass, I'm going to vote in favor of it because I want to please leadership. Well, I'm not one of those. I don't need to please leadership, and they know that of me. I'm going to vote for what is right. And if the bill is bad, I'm going to vote no. So, and oh, by the way, I'm not seeking a leadership position. I'm not seeking higher office. I am just wanting to serve my constituents and to serve them well.
Thank you. Bill?
There's certain political realities in any legislative body, and sometimes you do have to work to get along. West of Wichita, we have about 24 House members. Johnson County, Kansas has 24 House members. So we have to work with our eastern Kansas colleagues, many of whom are in leadership, so we can get things done for western Kansas. I agree with my colleague, Representative Wheeler. Sometimes we do see folks cast cynical votes and watch the board and go green or red depending on where the vote is going. But I believe in voting the district. My predecessor, Russ Jennings, educated me on how to do that, and I will follow those principles if you return me to the state legislature.
Bob?
I think the question presents a false choice. I don't think it's a question between voting your conscience and working with leadership. I know, and I've studied leadership in the House and Senate, and I generally support what they're doing. The other thing I would say is that, this idea that I don't want to be in leadership, why don't you want to be in leadership? If you're there and you have strong views on something, you would want to be in leadership so that you could see those views in your legislative results. So once again, I reject the idea that it's a question of, oh, am I going to vote my conscience or am I going to be in leadership? If I'm elected, I'm going to work with leadership and use my best judgment and urge them to follow that. But I'm going to be a cooperator, not an againster.
Corinne?
It makes me nervous to answer this question knowing that it's going to be on Facebook, but I will vote always with the people. I disagree that it's all right leadership because we couldn't get them to do anything when it comes to our elections and health freedom bills this last 2 sessions. There's also something I recently learned about called House Leadership Campaign fundraising, and that's concerning because where do they spend their campaign funds that they raise? Do they spend it to candidates that are going to be yes people, or do they spend it with, generally speaking, across the board? So I firmly believe that that legislators are not to be paternalistic overlords, that the judgment of the mind is always preferred over the edicts of government because edicts are not law.
Thank you. That concludes the question and answer session of tonight's forum. Candidates, we want to thank you for your time and willingness to be a part of this event. At this time, we will start with the 1-minute closing statements, and we will begin with Bill.
Thank you. And again, thanks to the sponsors for letting us get out our messages. As I said in my introduction, I came to Kansas 27 years ago because I thought it'd be a great place to raise my children and continue my life of service. And I've certainly found that to be true. Kansas values are my values. I'm pro-life. I have adopted children. I'm endorsed by Kansas for Life. I'm pro-Second Amendment. I learned firearms training in the military. I'm a life member of the NRA, supported by both the NRA and the KRA by endorsement. I'm pro-ag. Farm Bureau has reached out and endorsed me. But despite all these endorsements, what I really need and would appreciate is your vote on August 2nd. Thank you.
John?
Thank you. I again want to thank the Chamber and the sponsors for this forum. I think that people here know who I am. I've served this community in various capacities since I returned in 1976. I know this community. I've lived here, I've worked with it. I don't think that entitles me to anything, but I did notice an observation that, by golly, I'm going to cooperate with leadership. And I can tell you this, welcome to La La Land. If you don't go their way, you're going to be neutered. And I saw that happen this last session to one fine legislator.
Corinne?
Well, I didn't mention earlier, I was a RN graduate from Garden City Community College, and a very fine program, and I would recommend it highly, at least at the time, to anybody. An RN program that didn't require an LPN at the time was fantastic, but as exhibited by tonight, I think free speech allows us to express ideas. And from those multiple ideas, we get a lot of solutions. And those solutions come from you, the people, and the elected people that should be your voice to bring those solutions to the table.
Bob?
I want to thank the Chamber for sponsoring this and all the folks for coming out. For the last year, I've been walking door to door, talking with Garden Cityans. I've listened to you and I've heard you. You want a government you can trust, a government that protects your personhood, your property, your right to say your piece, the right to keep and bear arms, and to practice your religion. You believe that our society is overregulated, that it reflects an arrogant belief that government knows best. I believe that you and your family know best on important decisions, and that includes in directing your children's education. 5 years ago, I returned to my home to help my parents. This is a place that gave me life and set me on my path. I now want to give back. I want to represent you in Topeka, and I ask for your vote on August 2nd.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes tonight's program. Please join me again in thanking our candidates for their time. Thank you again to our sponsors, the Chamber Chairman Circle members, Commerce Bank, City of Garden City, Dairy Farmers of America, and Golden Plains Credit Union. We would also like to thank the 2022 legislative sponsors, St. Catherine Hospital, Compass Behavioral Health, Garden City Community College, and as I promised, no special treatment tonight for II Associates, Finney County Farm Bureau Association. As a reminder, there are a few short hours to be able to register for the election on August 2nd. You can go to ksvotes.org and complete an online registration with them. The primary election is set for Tuesday, August 2nd, as well as other ballot initiatives that we discussed here this evening. And we encourage the citizens of Garden City to get out and vote. Thank you.